My wife says I don't understand emotions. So, I invited the world's leading expert on emotions to help me understand what emotions are. Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett from Northeastern University is among top 1% scientists in the world for revolutionary research in psychology and neuroscience. Her book, How Emotions Are Made, became an international bestseller. In this conversation, we talked about emotions, their universal base, and their manifestations in different cultures. And we even touched upon the Jewish perspective. We also discussed some lessons for her latest book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. Want a teaser? Your brain was not created for thinking. Before we start the conversation, in this channel I speak with the most interesting and influential people from all around the world, discuss science, philosophy, artificial intelligence, and more. If you like this conversation, please consider subscribing, hit the bell button, and be part of this great community. There's lots more where that came from. So Lisa, thank you so much for coming. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. How are you?
Very excited, but now after reading your book about emotion, I don't know, I became self-conscious about being excited. What is this emotion precisely? Now, have you ever been in Israel?
I have. I've been in Israel several times, actually. The last time I was there, I was at a workshop, I guess, that was held at Hebrew University by a former colleague of mine and one of my former students, actually. So I have one of my former students on faculty there. And then we took my daughter on an archaeological tour with an archaeologist that we had really good fortune to hire an archaeologist. And so we got to tour some of the archaeological digs in Israel. So it was really, really fun. It was one of our best trips, I think. Yeah.
Wow. This is great. And one thing that you keep saying in your books is about different emotions, different cultures. And before we dig into the theory, what do you think about the Israeli type of emotions versus the American types of emotion? Could you distinguish between the two? Or we are just all West ones?
If I was using stereotypes, what I would say is that, because I'm Canadian, but anybody who talks to me will think I'm from New York. Actually, I would probably be seen as kind of a mild Israeli, because I'm a little bit kind of in your face, but maybe not as much. So I feel, if the stereotypes, right, are, my one of my former postdocs, Shir Atzil, who's on faculty at University of Jerusalem, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the two of us would get into these really intense debates, and sometimes other people would get really worried, and I'm like, no, we're totally in love, we're loving each other, we're like, this is what we're totally engaged with each other. This is so I would say that there are some cultures that have the stereotype in that culture is to be much more exuberant in the feeling of emotion and the expression of emotion, and other cultures are much more reserved. The assumption is that there's less expression and maybe even less intensity in the feeling. But I think the more interesting places where we see real cultural differences are not so much in the intensity dial. It's really where the categories, the actual emotions that people experience are very, very different. And there are some emotions that exist in some cultures that don't exist in English, don't exist in Hebrew, and vice versa. So that's, to us, where things get really, really interesting. It's not that you have an emotion, it's this physical thing, and then you label it or identify it. Your brain is involved in taking the signals from your body, the changes in heart rate and blood pressure and so on, and also the changes in the world and creating an emotion out of it. That's really how we understand it.
This is mind-blowing. Now, let's start. Okay. This is so fascinating. Okay, the first time I came across your name was with Lex Friedman, not on the podcast, but on his lesson. And what you said there was mesmerizing. You said, we in the AI community, and I consider myself being part of the AI community, we want to do AI systems that do emotion recognition, but we don't do that. We do facial recognition. We do facial expression, okay? This is smiling. It's like the very stupid smiley diagram. And what you said is one emotion can be divided into many different facial expression, like fear or joy. And one facial expression can be divided into many emotions. So in fact, when we want to do, okay, what do you feel right now? What are you feeling? And I look at your face, I barely can know anything. Could you please elaborate on this point?
I never said that we can't know anything.
No, okay.
I didn't
this
actually
is my,
say that,
okay, no.
Yeah. So
you can't
I think
be 100% sure.
Yeah, I'm gonna modify what you said with some language, but I will say that this is one of the most empirically, I feel so solidly, the empirical evidence behind what I'm about to say is so solid. I mean, I spent 2.5 years reviewing more than 1,000 published articles with 4 other senior scientists, some of whom believed in the universality of emotional expression, believed that when you're smiling, you're happy, and when you're happy, you're smiling, when you're angry, you're scowling, and when you're scowling, you're angry, and that everybody around the world does this and can recognize these facial movements as expressions. So some of us came to the table not having that hypothesis. Other people did. And in the end, 2.5 years later, the 5 of us, each of us very, very senior people in our own fields, came to great consensus over the evidence. And one of them was an engineer who does computer vision, and another was a computer scientist who builds, agents. So just so we're clear, here's the evidence. When you make, first of all, you can't refer to facial movements as facial expressions, because sometimes movements happen and they're not expressions of anything. So you really have to make a distinction between what you see and the meaning of what you see. So a facial movement like a smile is a movement. In fact, we could describe the movement in terms of facial muscles, but let's just, use a description like a smile, a scowl, a frown. Those are movements. You're inferring what the movement means. You're not detecting emotion, you're inferring it. And that's what everybody does all the time. And we do it pretty well, I think, actually, because we're not just using the facial movement itself, we're using an entire context of signals. Nobody, except in very odd psychology experiments, ever looks at a disembodied face and tries to try out what that face is expressing, okay? So here's what the evidence shows. About 35% of the time, when people are angry, they scowl. That's more than chance. So it means that scowling is one expression of anger. But
just
it
a
also
second,
means,
and this is culture dependent or culture independent?
I'm not even at culture yet. This is just in mostly Western urban settings. Okay, so let's not even get to culture. We'll get there in a minute. But people like us, okay, 35% of the time, if someone's scowling at you and you guess that they're angry, or you feel like you're detecting anger, you have some possibility of being right. But 65% of the time, people scowl when they're not, 65% of the time, people, when they're angry, are doing something else that's very meaningful with their face. Just think about the last time you got angry. Did you scowl? Has anybody ever won an Academy Award in the United States for depicting anger as a scowl? I mean, no, never. And that's because people do many things with their face when they're angry. But even more importantly, evidence shows that about half of the scowls that people make have nothing to do with anger. People scowl when they're concentrating really hard. This is something my husband does, actually. It's still disconcerting to me. I study emotion and I see him scowling and I say, "Are you angry?" And he's like,
Are you angry?
Who are you? What did you do with my wife? Like, and when I finally discovered this, I said to my students, "Can you believe that this man that I'm dating scowls when they're angry, when they're like, Dr. Barrett, actually then I was Dr. Feldman. We hate to tell you, but you do the same thing and it scared the bejesus out of us, So when I'm concentrating really hard on what they're saying, I'm like scowling at them. And okay, people scowl when you tell them a bad joke. People scowl when they have gas. People scowl all sorts of reasons. So that means that the reliability of scowling in anger is low, and the specificity of scowling in anger is low. You pick any emotion category and any Western stereotypic expression that has been claimed as the universal expression, and that's what you find. Now, when you start to look at cultural differences, things get even more variable.
Just a second. Before the cultural differences, nevertheless, what you said is 100% science. Nevertheless, I feel in my daily life that I can detect pretty good emotions, okay? With my spouse, maybe not my spouse, but with my friends, etc. And can it be due to the theory of mirror neuron?
Well, yes and no. So let me just say that, first of all, I feel like I'm pretty good at reading people's emotions too, but all of us, no matter how good you are, nobody's reading. Everybody's guessing. Motor neurons guess. Actually, if you want to call them motor neurons, we'll get to that in a second. Yes. But the neurons that are involved are guessing. It's an inference. It's not a read. You're not detecting anything. You're guessing based on past experience. And what you're guessing on is not one signal. It's not one signal from the face. It's the signals also around you. It's the signals also that are coming from that person. It's also the signals in your own body. I can manipulate your nervous system without your awareness, and it will change literally what you see in somebody else's face. So my point to you is that evidence shows that our confidence about anything that we think comes from a very different place than the actual perception that we're engaging in. Mirror neurons are not special kinds of neurons. They just do what neurons do, basically. Mirror neurons are a set of neurons that are in part of your brain called the premotor cortex, which is important for motor planning, for planning your own actions, and for planning your own actions and for perceiving other people's actions. So they're not special in any way, and they're involved in things other than, turns out, motor movements. They're it's a longer explanation than we have time for, but basically they're not detecting anything. They're just making an inference. And yeah, if you're a neurotypical person, you have a neurotypical brain, you spent your whole life interacting with people and learning about patterns. And your brain uses those patterns to make a pretty decent guess about what a particular set of facial movements means in a particular situation. And that's true for all of us, no matter what your subjective confidence level is. Nobody's reading anybody. Reading body language is a metaphor. Body movements aren't a language to be read like words on a page. They're inferred.
And guessed.
The meaning is inferred.
So what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying right now is that current AI system has almost no way of knowing what I'm feeling right now, because they lack
no way of knowing.
It knows much
No,
I
it
have
knows
the facial expression, the facial movement, but
no, the facial movement.
yes,
The best AI that I know of can detect movements, but not what those movements mean psychologically.
Okay, so let's move to the cultural dependent. This is before we went into the cultural, one culture versus another culture. If I go and inspect two cultures, two different cultures, one Western and one Chinese, what do I find out?
It depends on how much, first of all, it depends on whether it's an urban setting or a rural setting, in part because urban settings have much more access to Western cultural practices and norms than rural
What do
settings.
you mean? This is what we say peasant culture as
I'm
rural
not really
culture.
saying peasant culture. I'm saying how much, first of all, there are too many factors to identify them all, but basically, first of all, how much do people have access to Western things? Do they watch Western movies? Do they read Western books? Do they talk to Western people? So that's one issue. Another issue is how small is the culture? Meaning, are people interacting with 10 other people, with 20 other people? Are they interacting with 500 other people? How about 10,000 other people? So, what we find is that there's a gradient, really, of scowling in anger, smiling in happiness, frowning in sadness. These are Western stereotypes that have been around for a really long time. Like, go back to ancient Greece. Go back to whoever was the first person who was writing. I mean, the first person I know writing about facial expressions was, in ancient Greece, but maybe there's something even earlier than that. But those ideas have been around for a long time. And they're stereotypes, and stereotypes, are not, they don't come out of nowhere. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those stereotypes describe what people do. If you go to cultures where, like, very small, cultures that are more remote, so they're not completely isolated, right? But let's say, our lab has been to Tanzania to study the Hadza, who are hunter-gatherers, and we've been to Namibia to study the Himba, who are semi-pastoralists. They're not.
Let me give you just one, let me give my viewers one example from your latest book. When people from the island of Bali in Indonesia are afraid, they fall asleep, or at least that's what they are supposed to do. And this is a very different strategy to do when you're afraid than the Western strategy. And this is one example that depicts the massive difference between different cultures.
Well, what we think of as a stereotypic fear face, like wide eyes, gasping mouth, that's actually a face that expresses threat, that you are threatening someone, not that you're afraid of someone, but that you're threatening someone in Melanesia. So, the point being that if you go to cultures that are very different from ours, particularly cultures that are more, they're not completely remote from Western influence, but they're more isolated from Western influence. Maybe not isolated, it's not even the right word anymore, because nobody's isolated, but that they have less interaction with Westerners. You see vastly different emotional economies. Let's say people, the categories they use are different, the expressions are different, the feelings are combined in different ways. It's very, very different.
I had Richard Nisbet on the show, and one of his books that I love so much is The Geography of Thought. And what he says basically that when philosophers in the 17th, 16th, 18th century said all human beings are, mainly they said all Westerns are. And he said, no, the thought, even the rational, is very different from in China and the US. But what you're saying right now is also the emotions. So if
here's a really good example. In standard Western scripts, you are either feeling pleasant or you're feeling unpleasant. Like anger is unpleasant and happiness is pleasant. Sadness is unpleasant, fear is unpleasant, and compassion is pleasant. Well, first of all, even in people in the United States, there are flavors of anger that are very pleasant. There are flavors of happiness that are also unpleasant. And actually, there's a very common cultural difference in the relationship between pleasant and unpleasant features. So in the United States, you're either one or the other. And the idea is that if you're ambivalent, let's say, or you have something like nostalgia, what you're doing is you're kind of flipping back and forth between pleasant and unpleasant states. But in certain other cultures, actually, Israel is supposed to be one of these cultures. And actually, I'll just say it and then I'll tell you what my thoughts are. Also, Chinese culture, certain Chinese cultures, pleasant and unpleasant are not opposite states. They're actually features of the same state. So it's, and this is called dialecticism. There's a huge research literature on dialecticism and the differences in American experiences, which are either one or the other, and other cultures where there's more of a blend. And the blend is, it's not like you're flipping back and forth between two states. It's that these are features of the same state. And if you look at some Jewish customs, you can see that they are designed, in a sense, always to infuse features of one affective feeling into episodes that would come from another. So in moments of happiness, like a wedding, you're also remembering unpleasant things, like you step on a glass and that, that's supposed to remind you of the destruction of a temple or something similar. When you're sitting Shiva, someone's passed away, you're also supposed to remember positive things about that, pleasant things about that person. And as opposed to having these really polarized views of positive, negative. So that's also a dimension of variation. There are lots of dimensions of variation. In anger, for example, in an American version of anger, I mean, the stereotype, because there are lots of versions of anger, even in the United States, but in an American version, anger is distancing. When you're angry at someone, you're putting distance, psychologically distance between you and that other person. Also, you're putting yourself on top, like you are in a hierarchically dominant position and they're subordinate to you. That's the maneuver with anger, but stereotypically. But there are other versions of anger that actually do exist in the US, but that are more stereotypic in other cultures, like Turkish versions of anger, where anger is brings people closer together. So in anger is an indication of it's time to approach. It's an indication of caring for each other. It's an indication of it's kind of like, when my friend and former postdoc Sheer and I were really arguing with each other, things were getting pretty heated, but we didn't hate each other. We were actually demonstrating our intellectual and also commitment to each other and our affection for each other. So these are the subtle but very important transactional differences across cultures that are completely ignored and glossed over if you ignore, if you think about universality. I'll just give you one other example. This example is not mine. It's an example that comes from Lee Ross, who is a psychologist who passed away, but who maybe you're familiar with his work because he was very close with it. Worked. Yeah.
I tell you one thing that Richard told me about Lee Ross. He told me that Lee was a very lazy person. And I think I quote it word by word. He say, I beated 3 books out of Lee Ross.
I believe that. Well, Dick is very he's prolific. And the irritating thing about him is, you know, sentences come out of his mouth fully formed and beautifully reasoned. Like some of us have to work very hard, you know, to like make ourselves understood in a concise way. He just thinks very precisely and speaks very precisely. But Lee Ross, I remember listening to him talk. I think he was also really quite brilliant. I don't know about whether he was lazy or not, but he was certainly a brilliant scientist. And he made the observation that part of the difficulty that Israelis and Palestinians have is that the way Israelis speak when they are indicating commitment and care is offensive to Palestinians. So because Palestinians, the stereotype is that they're a culture of honor, and they don't, you know, there have to be certain patterns of politeness. And if you're an Israeli and you're really feeling intensely about something and you're telling that person because you really care, they're gonna, you know, a Palestinian will see that as offensive rather than as an indication of care. I'm not Israeli and I'm not Palestinian, so I can't say for sure, but I think that's a good example of at least a possible place where the belief in universality can get you into real trouble.
According to history, we don't offend them enough. Now, one thing that you said in your TED lecture, emotions don't happen to you, they made by you. And up until now, we just talked about the manifestations of different emotions. So the anger, the American version of anger is distant, and the Turkish version of anger is being closer together. But my question is, besides manifestation of the same feeling or the same emotion, anger, do they or Turkish and American experience a different entity or a different thing which they attribute to anger? But, you know, all the chemicals in the brain are totally different.
So here's the problem with the question that you're asking.
How do you investigate this?
Well, let me answer your question and then I'll tell you how we investigate it. Anger is not one thing, even for you or for me or for any American. There is no entity of anger. Anger is not an entity. It's a population of instances that are variable, that are constructed by your brain to fit the situation you're in. So some instances of anger involve increases in heart rate, and some involve decreases in heart rate, and some involve no change in heart rate. Some involve, you know, increases in cortisol, some involve decreases in cortisol, some involve no change in cortisol. There isn't a single brain pattern, there isn't a single chemical pattern, there isn't a single physiological pattern that anybody has ever identified in the entire time that people have been looking for such things ever, that is stable enough to say that anger is an entity. So the reason why the question isn't meaningful is that it's not that there's one pattern for anger in Turkish, in a Turkish brain, and a brain that's been pickled in Turkish culture, and that there's a different one for an American pattern in an American brain. It's that there isn't one pattern for anger in anybody's brain anywhere in the world. Your brain is capable of, your brain's most important job is regulating your body and trying to figure out how the stuff going on around you is relevant to you, to the change, to what does your brain have to do to keep you alive and well? What does it have to do inside your body so that you can move, so that you can deal with the world? That's really what's happening all the time. And you have a repertoire of things that you can do, and a repertoire of making sense of those things. And your way of making sense of those things are also in your brain. They're signals in your brain. So I guess my point is that you're, you know, just in the same way that Darwin said that a biological category like a species is not, there's no like perfect example of a dog, right? There's no perfect example. Only in dog shows do we have a perfect example of a Cocker Spaniel or a perfect, right? There's no perfect example of a dog. There's no perfect example of a human. There's no ideal or platonic version of any animal, of any species. There's just variation. And the same is true for all biological categories, including emotion categories. And we know this because we study what happens in people's brains, and we study what happens in animals' brains. Like if you put an animal like a rat in a threatening situation where it faces a predator, what does it do? Well, it does many things depending on the situation it's in. It might attack, it might freeze, it might run away, it might continue with business as usual, but just kind of be vigilant and paying attention. So it does many different things. And physiologists have known really since the 1960s that what your body does depends on what your brain's preparation for action is. So basically, your physiology goes with your physical action. And if the physical actions are different in different episodes of emotion, then the physiology is going to be different. The brain patterns will be different, and so on and so forth. And so we and other labs have spent a long time trying to understand these patterns, because that's really the scientific question. It's not what is the brain pattern for anger. It's what is the population, or what is the vocabulary of options for you, Roy, and for me, and are they the same, or do they have any overlap? I mean, you're a man, I'm a woman, you live in one country, I live in another country, but there are some similarities because we're both speaking English right now. It's not maybe your first language, and sometimes I feel like it's not my first language, but we're both speaking English, and we're both Jewish, and we might not have been raised in exactly the same Jewish culture, but we have some cultural similarities, but there are also cultural differences. So you can start to ask questions like, well, you know, your vocabulary for creating anger, how much, on what features, dimensions would it be similar to mine? And can we try to understand what's driving those similarities? Those are the kinds of questions that are scientifically viable, not questions like, what's the brain pattern? Where does anger live in the brain? What's the physical pattern for anger? And
or what is the meaning, the true meaning of anger? Because
there is no true meaning of anger.
Okay.
And frankly, there is no true meaning of anger for you or for me. You have a stereotype, but the true meaning of anger is that's like saying, what is the perfect version of a Cocker Spaniel? And the answer is there isn't one.
Yes.
That's not how biology works.
But when I read a Jewish moral text about, virtue, about how to better yourself, and they say something like the anger is a very bad virtue, is a very bad emotion, okay? And you need to steer away from anger. I guess that there is like an idea, like an idea of what anger is that we all can relate. This is not a private language like Wittgenstein said. We have like, if I say anger and you understand English, you get my point. Or I presume that you get my point, okay? So
sure, I get your point. And I will say that look,
maybe it's a range.
I'm going to say something super provocative now. Okay. Stereotypes don't completely come out of the blue. Okay. So 35% of the time people scowl in anger. So we could guess that maybe some proportion of the time, which is not zero, anger is destructive. I'm not saying scowling is destructive. I'm just using it as an analogy. So Maybe anger is destructive some proportion of the time, and maybe that proportion of the time is not zero. And so if you're talking to a large group of people and you're trying to make a rule for everybody, even though people are individuals and instances are different, if you're trying to make a rule, like think about, you know, you're trying to keep people from doing something which is sometimes bad for them, but not always, but maybe more than half the time. Then you make a rule and you follow that rule. So I guess what I would say is that the goal of religion is not to understand how things work. It's to
regulate your behavior,
it's
like
to regulate.
like maybe the emotions, like emotion are here to regulate, like your brain here to regulate your behavior.
Well, no, let me just say it again. A scientist's job is to understand how the brain works in regulating your behavior. A religion's job is to create moral codes that work for the largest number of people in the largest number of instances, but that doesn't make them true all the time. And it doesn't even make them good explanations for how things work. So I think that, you know, there's a Buddhist saying about anger, right? Anger is a form of ignorance. Anger is a form of ignorance. If you're angry at somebody, it means you are not taking that other person's perspective and you're only informed on half the story of what's going on. I find this to be an extremely useful regulatory strategy. As someone who is prone to anger, I think
that the key word here is useful. This is useful, and
yes,
if
but
we
useful,
have it, yes.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, so one thing, I think you're absolutely correct, and all truth in the humanities are only aggregate truth. You don't have like a one. I study intelligence, human intelligence, and I wrote a book about it, and I spoke with all the major researchers in intelligence, and all truth that we can say about human intelligence are aggregate. Okay.
Yes.
Now, aggregate truth in the humanities are extremely important when you're doing policy making or when you go to many programs, but it is only aggregate. And I totally agree that also like the moral code of religion or other aspect in the humanities may be aggregate. I will ask you one last thing regarding the ancient Jewish wisdom about emotions, because yes.
Before you ask me, let me just make a point about in the aggregate, because I think this is really, you've just hit on something that's like super important. Okay. And that's the following, that what Darwin said about, this is in On the Origin of Species, right? What he said about the aggregate is that it's a myth. It's a myth. It's an abstraction. It doesn't really exist. What really exists is variation. And in fact, when you look at every experiment, like there is something called the myth of the mean, which means that when you look at experiments, what you see is that that most participants, whether they're humans or non-human animals, don't actually conform to the mean. There's variation, and that variation is meaningful. It's not error. So when I'm talking to the public, I'll say, you know, the average American middle-class family has 3.3 people in it. I don't know what the number is now, but you know, what family has 3.3 people in it? No family has 3.3 people in it. That's the point. The point is that it's an abstraction. Abstractions work for some things and they don't work for others. So what I would say is that if you're trying to speak to millions of people who are very different in very different situations themselves from one moment to the next, maybe the aggregate is the best you can do. But that's not the goal of science. The goal of science is to really understand how something works for somebody in a particular situation. Because when you only deal in aggregates, you make very, very, very big mistakes. I'm not the person who, I mean, Darwin was one person who said that. And there have been a number of people. I'll just say one other thing. You know, like there are studies that will look inside the brain of someone, of different people while they're experiencing, you know, some emotion, like say happiness or fear or anger, sadness, whatever. And they find a single pattern across the brain for that emotion. That's not a brain state. It's an aggregate abstraction. And actually we did a simulation to show that if you look at that pattern first of all, if you look at that pattern for anger or any emotion in one study, it's different in every single study. Okay. And you can't actually predict one person's experience of anger in one study using the same pattern as for somebody else in some other study. But more importantly, you and I could be in an experiment, and that experiment could find a pattern for anger, but not a single element in that pattern could be in your brain when you're angry or my brain when I'm angry. And that pattern would still work to classify when we're angry, because sometimes aggregates are just good enough. They're not precise and they're not accurate, but they're good enough, right? So in the humanities, maybe they're good enough, but in science, they're not good enough. And in real life, they're probably not good enough either, because you said, you don't maybe, you can't infer maybe very well your wife's emotions, but, human brains are pattern learners. And my husband is so good at making guesses about what I'm experiencing, even sometimes before I become aware of what I'm experiencing. He's really, really good. He pays a lot of attention and he's really, really good at it. But he got good at it over a 30-year period, right? It's not like we just met and he was good at it. He learned, and his brain doesn't use aggregates. It uses situated instances.
Yes, but I was trained as a mentalist, as a mind reader, and this is a very cool job. And when people think or ask about what do you need to become a mind reader, I tell them, when you go to a restaurant, do you choose to sit in front of the wall or in front of everyone? Right? So this is one thing, that separate people. Some people love to watch, love to gaze, are interested in other people. And when you're interested long enough and you pay close attention, some patterns, as you say, will emerge. You can detect those patterns.
Yes, but your brain is not doing it in aggregate. Your brain is doing it in instances. That's how brains work. They generalize based on instances. If your brain was only generalizing based on aggregates of what you had learned, you would be very...
Absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Nevertheless, again, in the humanities, we have nothing but aggregation. And this is part of what many people do in the academia, okay? You have nothing but aggregation because every person is different. And
I want to push back a little bit, though, because, first of all, in science, there are many scientists who've come to the realization that aggregates are not helpful. And then they're trying much more to observe and model individual instances and build generalizations based on features of similarity, patterns of similarity. But let me just give you an example and you tell me. So philosophers are all the time dealing in instances. One philosopher gives one example, maybe they're using an example to try to make a point, and then the other philosopher says, well, but what about this, and what about that, and what about that, and what about... They're constantly introducing situated variation and trying to reason their way through it. Historians also deal very much with that's what historiography is all about. It's about saying that, things happen in a particular place at a particular time. They have a particular meaning in that place and time, and they may not have the same meaning in some other place and time. So I don't know. I think that aren't there in Jewish in the study of Judaism over time, haven't really learned rabbis debated the meaning of things based on... there are some people who take the Torah literally, but there are also a lot of rabbis who debate the meaning of something in particular situated circumstances, don't they?
But the idea is, what are we debating about? Are we debating on what is the truth? What is the real truth? For example, what God wants. let's say that there is one truth and we are all trying to approach this truth, okay? And I think maybe when I say aggregate, I didn't explain myself because what I meant is in physics, I can replicate an experiment over and over again. And if once the experiment fails, the entire theory just falls. And this happened in in the mechanic of Newton, and it happened with quantum mechanics. You just need one instance that what you thought in physics didn't occur, and the entire theory is wrong. But
well, that's not exactly true in quantum mechanics. So let me just say that what you're describing there is Karl Popper's view of falsification in science. And that view works very well for essentialist views like Newtonian physics, but it doesn't work particularly well for any kind of causality that is complex, where there's complexity into causation. You expect, if things are probabilistic, you expect sometimes that things won't replicate because something probabilistically is different. So what I would say
No. I beg to differ. Of course, some part of quantum mechanics are probabilistic, and therefore we can't duplicate or replicate the experiment. But I can give you a scenario in quantum mechanics that if the experiment goes like this, the entire theory fall apart. Yes,
but
I can give you.
That's different than saying I'm not replicating something.
No. Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. I mean, sure.
Yes.
I mean, there are conditions of outcomes that can falsify. If you can't falsify a hypothesis,
very good.
You're not doing science.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, but
what do I need to do? What do I need to do? What experiments do I need to conduct in order to falsify, for example, your theory about emotions?
Well, okay. So first of all, if you could show me that somebody, doesn't actually have to know a concept. They don't have to have a concept in order to be able to read a particular facial movement as an expression of emotion to detect, right? If you could take somebody, for example, like let's say I take somebody who has semantic aphasia. They've lost all their concepts. They have no concepts. They don't know the meanings of signals anymore, right? They can't conceptually tell you anything, but they can still detect fear in wide-eyed gasping faces and scowls in anger. That would be a falsification of our view because people with semantic dementia don't have.
Yes, but if you don't have a concept, this is a very big
no,
demand,
you don't need
no?
it. You shouldn't. No, look, the view that emotions are universal doesn't require a concept. In fact, concepts are what some of my colleagues would say is, look, emotion is one thing. A concept for emotion is another thing. You don't need concepts to feel emotion. You don't need concepts to recognize emotion. They're just there in the biology. Well, okay. So then take somebody who doesn't have concepts. Take an infant who doesn't have concepts yet. That's hard because infants develop concepts early. But take a newborn.
How can I communicate? How can I communicate my feeling of emotion?
Okay, here's an example. Here's an example of a study we did. We took people who had semantic dementia or semantic aphasia. These have also been done with people with semantic aphasia. And you just say, sort all the faces that are similar to each other in terms of the emotion being expressed. We don't ask them to tell us what the emotion is. We don't ask them to, they just like, sort all the people into the same pile who feel the same way. They should be able to do it without labeling the emotion, without telling you what the emotions are.
Yeah.
They can't.
Okay.
They can't. Yeah.
This is very interesting. I think that this is a great talk. Okay. It's not it's
right, but I'm not angry.
No, okay,
I'm totally engaged with you.
No. This is great because we are both Jewish. So there is a verse in Jewish tradition. It's called Ritcha Deoraita. It's like the anger of the Torah. If you are well into one thing, you are just. This is so meaningful.
You need to send me the name of that concept because I think I need that one.
I will write it in Hebrew and then in English.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. But that's a really good example of that's a variety or a flavor because it's not just anger, right? It's, I mean, what you would say is it has some features of anger, but it also has some features of excitement. It has some features of engagement. And it also sometimes has features of affection. Like I can tell you that I spent 2.5 years arguing with my colleagues, and I love each other to death now. Like I mean, these guys are some of my favorite people in the whole world. Not that I wasn't infuriated in our debates sometimes.
You know,
but
in Tel Aviv University, there is a very, very smart ritual. There, before the PhD graduation, the advisor and the students gather in the synagogue, and they need to make out. No, make peace. I don't know how you say, okay? Because after 4 years of your dissertation, you probably are very mad at your advisor. So before the ceremony starts, they meet at the synagogue and make peace. And I think that this is wonderful. Now, let's take an article that was published in 2018, Maps of Subjective Feelings by Rועי, I said, Numena, okay? And she said, you probably are familiar with.
It's he.
He. Okay, so Rועי is an. Okay, I'm sorry. Anyway, and the idea is very, very nice. I ask people to pinpoint the place in the body where they're feeling special emotions. And what the article says, and the earlier version in 2013, that this is culture independent.
Well, let me tell you something.
What do you think about this?
I actually ran studies like this using exactly this method with a former postdoc of mine. Her name is Susanna Osterbeek, maybe a decade ago. And we decided not to publish them. And the reason why is because we thought, well, we're just asking people their subjective beliefs. I mean, when you actually measure, if you measure physiological signals in the body and you ask people to report on their subjective experience of those sensations, they don't match. The objective measures don't match the subjective ones. You may feel that you are very in touch with what's going on inside your body, but you're not. And in fact, the wiring in your nervous system is designed in such a way that all you have is a vague sense of where a sensory change is happening. You don't actually have precision. So we thought, well, nobody would believe. People will just look at this and say, oh, well, these are just people's beliefs about where emotions are felt. And no one will think that that's interesting. So we're not going to publish it. And then what happens? Almost a decade later, in one of the best journals, they fail to make a distinction between what people say they feel and where the sensations are actually taking place. Like they treat a person's report of where they feel emotion in the body as literally where emotion exists in the body. That's hugely problematic. And also, I would say, they're taking an aggregate of one culture and an aggregate of another culture and an aggregate of another culture. And they're looking at the similarity across aggregates when in fact, there's tremendous variation within each culture. So what I would say, and not even that, if I tested you, Roy, every time you felt anger, where do you feel it? Where do you feel it in your body? Where do you feel in your body? In lots of different situations, you would not say the same place. So I guess my point is that what that shows, which is interesting, is that general aggregate beliefs about emotion, stereotypes about emotion, are very similar across some cultures. But it says absolutely nothing, not a thing, nothing about where sensations are occurring and how stable they are in any individual in any culture. Nothing.
Maybe that shows how much we seek for the universality of emotions.
Yes. And then you can start asking questions like,
ברוך אתה אדוני
why?
מלכנו שהכל נהיה בדברו.
Yeah, exactly.
Amen.
Why? Amen. Why? Why do people seek it? So that's like a really interesting question, right? Like, why do people feel the need to, why is it important to find, like, it's so important that people are ignoring basic rules of science, right? I mean, I sort of got to the point where I thought, I'm a clinician by training, right? So before I became a neuroscientist, before I became a physiologist, before I became a cognitive scientist,
Clinical psychology.
I was a clinician. And one of the things we do in clinical science, right, and is that we ask questions of our clients. We say, well, you know, you believe this, but here's the evidence. Like, here's the evidence, right? This is what happened, but you believe this. So, you know, like, what's going on here? And I kind of feel the same thing about this field. I'm like, what is happening? That evidence has been around for more than a century of tremendous variability, despite the fact that people are looking for the sameness. There's just tremendous variation that's structured and reliable. If you try to measure it, it's predictable, it's reliable within a person. Like, but why would people continue to search for these biological
Sameness?
Like, yeah.
But it's like metacognition. It's our emotions regarding emotions. And let's say that I'm an author. I want to describe a scenario, and I want all human beings to resonate with my scenario, with my feelings. The tendency of, being part of the entire
I don't think
human being community.
I think that's only part of it, because you know why? Everybody loves variation. We love variation in food. We love variation in clothes. We love variation in books and movies. We love variation in everything except each other. For each other, for other humans, we want everything to be the same. We really like sameness. And so I think that's part of it. I don't think that's the whole story, but I definitely think that's part of it. But I guess what I would say is, I don't feel like I have to convince anybody of anything. I think the data speak for themselves. And my job is to just show you the data and make sure that you pay attention to it, that you don't just say, well, I'm just going to not pay attention to this because I don't like how you did your study, or, like, okay, you don't like how I did study A, but then there's study B, C, D, E, and F that show the same thing, that we're using different methods. So, my job is to just bring that to light and show you and say, and to show my colleagues, and say, here's the evidence. And then people will do what they do.
Now, in your latest book, and 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, which is a small but immensely packed book, very, very interesting. One of the lessons, I think lesson number 3, is that your brain is doing predictions all the time. And
Sure.
I just want to quote 2 sentences from this chapter. Instead, think of the last time you were thirsty and drank a glass of water. Within seconds after draining the last drop, you probably felt less thirsty. This event might seem ordinary, but water actually takes about 20 minutes to reach your bloodstream. Water can't possibly quench your thirst in a few seconds. So what relieved your thirst? Prediction. This is great. Your brain, our brain, makes predictions all the time, and based on that prediction, we live. And basically, memory is that I take something from the past in the context of the present, of the present, and manipulate or postulate about the future. We don't remember anything as a SD card. Could you please elaborate on this point? Because I think this is one of the 7.5 lessons that just strikes me.
Well, there's a number. So as you can tell, probably I'm a pretty skeptical person, and that's probably why I'm a scientist, you know?
I think that you are far away from the microphone.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'm getting too relaxed. I'm getting too relaxed talking to you. That's the point. Right? I'm having too much fun, and I'm.
You started
like,
here. You started
yeah.
here, and now you are.
Okay. Yeah. Well, no. I'm kind of leaning on my chair and relaxing. So
take the microphone with you, Lisa.
Yeah, I'm worried that I'm going to hit my computer or something, and then like, lose the connection again. But yeah. Okay. So evidence from lots of different scientific fields that don't talk to each other all show evidence that the brain is not reacting to things in the world, it's predicting. So you and I experience the world as if we see something, we hear something, and then we react to it. Maybe we think about it, maybe we don't. We have emotions, we have thoughts, and they fight with each other for control of our behavior in reaction to whatever we see and hear and smell and so on. But that's actually not how our brains work at all. Our brains are actually predicting. So if we were to stop time right now, your brain would be representing what is going on in your body and in the world, and predicting based on patterns of experience from the past, predicting what you're going to see next, hear next, smell next, feel next, do next. And those predictions are not abstract things. You're not aware of that your brain doesn't make itself aware that it's doing this. These predictions are your brain changing the firing of its own neurons in anticipation of what it expects. And the sense
changing
data,
the firing of its own neuron. The brain
so for example,
manipulates itself in the process of predicting.
That's right. That's what we call intrinsic activity. That's what's called intrinsic activity of the brain. So for example, if I ask you, have you ever had a song go through your head that you cannot get out of your head? It's just a song that, like, you've heard in the past that you can't get out of your head. That's the same thing as a prediction signal. It's exactly the same thing. And I have all these examples that I show people where, they can't possibly predict what's on the screen. And they're experientially blind to it. And then I create an experience for them. And then I show them the image again, and all of a sudden they can see something. And it's because their brain at that point predicted, because I gave them an experience that their brain could then use to make a prediction. So your brain is always predicting all the time. And what we say what we call memory, what we call perception, what we call perceptual inference, even what I call concepts or categories, those are all words for the same process, basically. Your brain is constantly using the past to predict the immediate future. It's actually starting to prepare what it will see and hear and smell and feel and do in anticipation of those sensory signals from the body and from the world. And the real mind blower is, if the sense data are as the brain predicted, okay, then they're just there to confirm those predictions. The neurons are already firing in a way to create the experience. And so poof, you have the experience. So when the sense data are as the brain predicts, those sensory signals don't make it very far into the brain. They don't have to, because they've done their job. But if there are differences, what we would call prediction errors, then the brain has a choice. It can learn those errors. That's what we call learning.
Or ignore them.
I'm sorry, or ignore them. Exactly.
Let me tell you one thing that I used to do. There is like a gimmick wallet that you open it and there is fire out of the wallet. And during the magic show, this is one hell of a trick, okay? You open your wallet and then fire out of the wallet. Now, if you do the same trick without the context of a magic show, many people won't notice the fire. They simply don't notice.
They have inattentional blindness.
Yes. They say, they see the fire, but they say, no, fire can come out of the wallet. Therefore, I don't see the fire. They don't make it as a conscious thing, but they just don't react to the fire because the prediction, there was an error in the prediction. When I opened the wallet,
yes, but the
there
brain,
should be a wallet.
But the brain doesn't just predict the signals of sense data. It also predicts which errors it will care about. Like if it predicts that the errors are irrelevant to, there's no need to spend the metabolic resources to learn them. So and that's what we call salience. Salience is the prediction that things matter to your well-being, to the physical well-being of your body. There has to be metabolic value, meaning that why would you spend resources to learn something if it's not going to be useful to you in the future? You wouldn't. It would be silly. It'd be squandering resources. So the brain's only going to learn stuff that it believes is going to be useful for better predictions in the future, because that actually reduces metabolic cost. And then that metabolic cost can be used for other things like having offspring, for example, right? So that's the argument that the brain is always, it's got lots of different things to do and limited resources, and it has to make decisions. And that's why so what the brain is learning is not particular signals, it's learning ensembles of signals. And let's say
that I read chapter 4. This is like the 4th lesson of the 7.5 lessons, and I want to take something to my life. I want to alter or change something in my life based on your wisdom that the brain does prediction all the time. What can I alter? What can I change in my life in all that suit this conclusion, this scientific conclusion about the brain?
Well, there are two things I would say that you could do, that you could take away. One is your brain will, your health and your well-being are dependent on how well your brain predicts flexibly in different situations. So you can deliberately, just like you would exercise, you expend metabolic energy in the moment to create a healthier, stronger body, right? In the future, you can deliberately engage, create experiences for yourself, cultivate them, which is expensive metabolically, but you can deliberately expose yourself to novel situations, to ideas that you don't particularly like. Be curious about the world, be curious about yourself in the world, be curious about other people in the world. All of these things actually create experiences that your brain will learn. And then
make your brain a better predictor.
Yeah.
By making new novel scenarios where your brain needs to predict new things.
Yeah. And for some things we know this, right? Like you might spend a lot of time learning a new skill, for example, and sometimes it feels unpleasant to, like, you're working really hard at something and it feels unpleasant. It feels unpleasant because it's expensive metabolically.
And you need to rewire your neurons when you learn something new.
It's understanding that discomfort doesn't always mean something is wrong. Discomfort can also mean you're just doing something hard, like you're doing something that's metabolically costly, and that's why something can be unpleasant. And so,
I had Bob York on the show, and he introduced the concept of deliberate, desirable difficulties. When something is hard, but nevertheless, this is desirable. This difficulty is very important for you. Now, another,
so I would say,
yes, please.
Yeah, I would just say curiosity is one thing. And the other thing is, humility, a little humility, because it doesn't really matter how confident you feel about anything. Your brain is always guessing, and it's guessing based on your past experience. And you could be wrong. It doesn't matter how confident you feel. You could be wrong. So a little humility, right? Like a little curiosity and a little humility goes a long way, I think.
I was told that ever since the war of Yom Kippur in Israel, the Israeli intelligence is very, very keen on this very subject. And the idea of the entire Israeli intelligence is that any soldier, it can be, the lowest in the, the bottom in the order, can say in front of the chief officer everything he wants, because we want this humility after Yom Kippur, after this was injected to the Israeli intelligence. The idea that we may be wrong. We may be wrong. So this is so true. Now, there is one word that keeps showing up in your books, but especially in the 7.5 lesson. And this word is, you want to guess? One word that you keep writing over and over again.
Well, I'm sure there are multiple words I keep writing
Yes,
over and over again.
but I'm referring to one word, and the word is budget.
Oh, body budgeting.
This is a very important word. And I think this has to do with the half lesson, not the half lesson of the 7.5 lesson is that our brain is not for thinking, is for regulating or managing the budget of, and the budget may be the resources that we have, the mental, the physical, everything. So the brain is not for thinking. We need to be very careful about how we manage the budget, since the brain is the most expensive organ. Could you please elaborate on this point? Because it's extremely important.
Yes. So, of course, your brain does think. But the point that I was making is that brains didn't evolve to be able to think. That if you look at the evolution of the vertebrate brain, and we're vertebrates, what you see is that brains appeared in animals at the same time as senses developed. So being able to see and hear and smell and feel and so on. And also as bodies got bigger and much more complicated. And the idea that the brain is anticipating the needs of the body and meeting those needs before they arise that prediction is really for coordinating the gazillions of parts inside your body and regulating them in a metabolically efficient way. That idea is called allostasis. It's a big word. And the metaphor that I use is body budgeting. And as I talk about, I think in essay 1, all metaphors are wrong. Okay. All metaphors are wrong. But in science, sometimes you need metaphors to explain complicated ideas. And so you pick the one that you think is the least wrong for your purposes. And so I think body budgeting is a pretty good metaphor for my purposes, which is your brain isn't budgeting money. It's budgeting resources like glucose and oxygen and salt and water and so on that are required by your cells to keep for your cells to stay alive. And your brain, you have trillions of cells in your body that all have to work together in an efficient way. And so you can think about your brain as a body budgeting device in a sense. And it's making decisions about what to spend, when to save. And many of the things that we worry about in everyday life, depression, anxiety, physical illnesses like diabetes, heart disease, these are all problems of body budgeting. They're all problems of allostasis. They're problems of energy, metabolism regulation.
Could you please explain this Latin word? What does it mean?
Allostasis means finding balance in change, I think.
Okay.
That it basically, the goal isn't to spend nothing. The goal is to spend efficiently. Because of course you have to spend. You have to spend when you move your body, you have to spend. When you learn something new, you're spending. So if you have to stay alive. To stay alive, you have to spend. But what you want to do is spend in an efficient way.
And in a recent interview, you just said that this is correlated with longevity, because if you manage your budget efficiently, you will live longer.
Yes. And in fact, metabolic problems like heart disease, diabetes, whatever, they have something in common with depression and anxiety, which people usually think of as mental illnesses, but really depression is like a bankrupt body budget. Basically, it's like you just, what do you do when your financial budget is bankrupt, or running a deficit? You stop spending. And what does it mean to stop spending in a brain? Well, it means that you stop moving your body and you stop learning. You become stuck in you're kind of stuck in your own head, and you don't respond to what's around you in the world as well. And those are two very, very salient symptoms of depression, for example. And I mean, I could go on and on and on about this, and we don't have time, but I will say that metaphorically, you could also think about other things which are really expensive metabolically, like democracy is expensive metabolically. You're constantly engaging with people who you disagree with in order to, well, at least in principle, in order to find a compromise. And there's a lot of discomfort there because there's a lot of body budgeting implications, right? And you could also, think about authoritarianism as a complete failure of budgeting. Like somebody who's, really compromised metabolically may not have the spoons to engage with lots of ideas, and, might be instead, looking for simple single solutions to things, and they don't have to think very much, and they can be told by someone what to do, like an authority figure and so on. It's hard to know, Roy, how far to stretch these metaphors. And I'm certainly not claiming that any of these things are true, that metabolics has something to do with politics or what have you. But I think it's an interesting avenue for exploration, is what I would say.
Wow. Now, we don't have much more time. Therefore, unfortunately, we can't go into that. We don't have a lizard brain. This is a great... This is a great chapter, and I wanted to ask you about the book The Master and his Emissary, about the right left brain functionality, but I won't go into this. I just want to mention one quote that I loved so much from your book about the nature-nurture debate. We have the kind of nature that requires nurture. And this is great, because this is basically what we're doing right now. You have a baby, and this baby is equipped with so more neurons than an adult, and in the process of pruning, and this is what we do in artificial intelligence or artificial intelligent networks, we just cut. And this procedure of cutting neurons is nurture. This is what you say. Basically, yes?
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you just about this very question about nature versus nurture. I had a discussion on this channel with a very famous Israeli child neurologist, and I asked him, what is a barrier? What is a borderline between telling a child just behave, just sit on the chair and listen to the teacher and be polite, okay? Work on your virtues and say, okay, you must take medications. What is the borderline that you can say from here, this is just neurological defect? And he said there is no one clear borderline. This is a range. What you take on how much can we work on our virtue, on our bad tendency, I don't know how you call it in English, and when you say, no, this is all part of the wiring system that our brain has?
Well, I would say that expecting young children to sit for 3 or 4 hours at a time doing things that they don't find all that interesting isn't a virtue. And the fact that we consider it a virtue and medicate children so that they can do it is hugely problematic. But that's not what we're talking about here. Okay. So I will just say that there are other ways to educate children. You know, Montessori had Maria Montessori had a very different way. I'm not saying that that's what should be done, but I'm saying there isn't only one way to educate a child. And in fact, Temple Grandin had a fantastic op-ed in the New York Times this morning about this issue. So when we give children medication, we're giving them medication because we want them to conform to a set of behaviors that we think are the behaviors they should be conforming to. But there are other ways to teach children that don't require
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Antidepressant among adults, okay? Just don't be sad because your life is incredible and take antidepressants.
Well, don't be sad doesn't work. Like thinking differently to feel differently doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is that, the way our brains work is it prepares action first and experience second. So, what you have to do, it's probably the feeling that's driving the thinking and not the other way around. But actually a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy is not about thinking, it's about doing, and doing actually helps you think differently. It helps you feel differently, and it helps you think differently. But just sitting around thinking isn't really going to help you very much. But I would say that once your body budget, like a lot of what's been going on, for the past couple of years with COVID, the COVID pandemic, left people really depleted, and they were depleted before. I mean, one of the things that depletes a human body budget, uncertainty. Uncertainty is very bad for like prolonged uncertainty, very bad for a human body budget, like really bad, and it will deplete you. So the story that we've, like our fight and flight circuits have been overloaded and all that. We don't have fight or flight circuits. Like the circuits that people talk about as fight or flight circuits are active. They're regulating your body all the time, even when you just like remember a phone number. I mean, really mundane things. So no, what's happening is there's been prolonged uncertainty after a period of time where there was already body budgeting deficits for other reasons. And so people are depleted. Now, when you're depleted, you feel bad, you feel unpleasant, and your normal tendency is to look around in the world and go, what's wrong with my life? But it could be that you just need to sleep better, and you need to hydrate properly, and you need to eat healthfully, and you need to exercise. And you would be amazed. I'm not saying that everything like serious illness is reducible to changing a few things, but you'd be surprised actually how much different things feel when you're well rested and, eating healthfully and so on. But there does come a certain point, a tipping point, where no amount of self-care is going to help you. And where you need to make a massive deposit, so to speak, into your body budget. And that's partly what's happening when you take an SSRI, metaphorically speaking. When you take an SSRI, which is the most common kind of antidepressant, or a SNRI, which is acting not on serotonin, but on norepinephrine, what's happening is you're kind of juicing the system. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that brains use. Actually, your cells all over your body use it for energy regulation. And the neurons, one of the things it does for neurons in the brain is it allows the brain to track your reinforcement history, meaning what do you get for the energy that you spend? Okay. And it allows animals to work when there's no forage for information, when there's no immediate reward in sight. So it's actually getting the animal to learn about new circumstances to build that predictive model. And that can be a really good thing if all you have is a body budgeting deficit. It can kind of get you out of that hole so that you can start learning about the world again and engaging with the world again. But if you live in a world that's full of uncertainty or violence or deprivation. If you actually have a metabolic drag, like there's something wrong with your mitochondria, or there's like a problem in your body, then taking serotonin, reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, is not going to help you.
It's just alone and alone and alone.
It's alone and alone and alone. And you know what happens when you keep taking loans and you can't pay them back? You go further and further into debt.
Wow,
and
this metaphor of body budgeting and what you say about the SSRI is eye-opening. I don't know how to say it, but this is so smart.
So the body budgeting metaphor is a useful metaphor. It has some things, as I said, it has some things wrong with it. It's not perfect, but it's a useful metaphor for remembering that we live our lives, Roy. We don't think about body budget. We don't think about metabolic cost of anything. We don't think about that when we're giving a hug to someone, or we're withstanding an insult from someone, or we don't. That's not how we experience ourselves. But under the hood, that is what your brain is always doing as it creates feelings and thoughts and so on. And it's a good thing. Once you know that, you start to see things a little differently, and you start to make decisions a little differently.
Great. One last thing is what you said about doing is much better. This was the take of Aristotle in his Ethics. In contrary to Plato's Socrates, who said, if you know the right thing, you will do the right thing. And Maimonides and the entire Jewish wisdom took this approach where after what you do, your emotion will follow. Your emotions will follow. And doing is much more important than feeling or thinking. And there is another verse, I don't know how to translate it, where the difference between the tzaddik and rasha, the bad guy and the good guy, is in which position your heart is. Is your heart controls you, or you control your heart? If you control your heart, you're the bad guy. You're the good guy. Because what you're doing is much more important than what you're thinking. And I will say even more, what you are doing is defining who you are. You are what you do, what you do, and know what you feel.
Exactly. So I don't know about the heart and the head and so on. That we could have a conversation about that. But I think that the entire reason that we bat mitzvahed our daughter actually was so that she could learn that what you do is more important than what you think and what you feel. I mean, it's good. It's great to think righteous thoughts, and it's good to feel, to have the right feelings but the point is that actually who you are is constituted by what you do, There's a saying that sometimes, like, I counter on the internet sometimes, especially when I'm like, responding to someone who's emailed me, or when I'm exercising or something. I'll sometimes see it where they say something like, I am, I can, I will, I do. And I think, no. That's essentialist. No, it's really, I can.
I do, I can, I am.
No, it's I can, I will, I do, I am. You are what you do. And I do think that this is a fundamentally Jewish way of thinking that is not, that is somewhat different from other...
the postmodern world that we are in right now.
Yes. And I also think that it has very strong implications. I don't have to tell you.
Yes, definitely. About
very strong implications,
relationships, about family, about how you parenting your children.
Yes.
What you do is much more important than what you think.
And it also means that you have an extra modicum of responsibility that you don't have in some other meaning systems. And I think that's also something that is true of our way of, like, our scientific framework. In our scientific framework, you're responsible for what you do. And sometimes you're responsible for things, not because you're culpable, not because you caused something bad, but because you're the only one who can change your predictions. You're the only one who can do it. It's hard. You don't see the results right away. It's never easy to do, but you can do it, and you're the only one who can do it. And so that there's a freedom that comes with that responsibility, but there is responsibility there that isn't there if you believe that, you know, your emotions are your inner beasts that are programmed into your brain at birth, and that cognition is, you know, has to battle your inner beast in order for you to behave properly.
Definitely. Lisa, thank you so much for your time. This was an eye-opening, mind-blowing, inspiring conversation. I loved I called it in Israeli fight. I love to lariv, but it was very, very enjoyable. Thank you so much for your time.
It was my great pleasure. This was so much fun. Thank you so much.